Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESGCB. My name is Taylor Bilbrey and I am today's moderator. If you're just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. And as a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for the public record. Office hours recordings are available on the California ESGCB Past Trainings webpage. A copy of the slide deck and recording will also be available to you. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and provide you answers if possible throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESGCB grant administrators, and other consultants who will be able to answer questions during the Q&A session. Sorry, I'm trying to do slides. Okay. So our agenda for today, we're going to go through some ESG and ESGCB updates, our office hour updates, upcoming trainings, ESGCB Q&As, and our Spotlight Series presentation on emergency shelter requirements and eligibility documentation. And I will pass it to Sarah for some ESG annual updates.
Good morning, everyone. Afternoon for some of our ICF folks. So same thing as last week in regards to our annual ESG updates for our 2021 contracts. Please remember, if you have not entered your contract number into HMIS, this must be done by the end of this month. So you have until, I believe, the 28th is Tuesday. If you have any questions, please email me directly at sarah.theobald@hcd.ca.gov. Remember, we have our Homeless Management Information System HMIS Setup Guide on our ESG webpage under the Resources tab. So for your 2021 standard agreements, remember, if you've been awarded homelessness prevention funding and you have not turned in your policies and procedures for us to review and approve, we will not reimburse any expenses for HP until this process has been completed. There are still a few folks that have not done so. If you have any questions in regards to that, please email us at esgnova@hcd.ca.gov so that we can provide you with a copy of the HP policies and the checklist, which you can also find on our ESG homepage under the Resources tab. If you still need help navigating the eCivis system to complete your RFFs or to add additional people from your agency, please reach out to esgnova@hcd.ca.gov and we'll provide TA to you. Next slide, please. So remember, avoid receiving STD 209s and reimbursement delays. All contracts moving forward, starting with the 2021 contracts, are managed through eCivis. So all requests for funds must be submitted through the system by clicking the Financial Report tab. Do not email those requests to your representative. If you would like to send an email to your rep letting them know that you have submitted your request, that's perfectly fine, but do not submit your actual request to your rep. So every RFF must include a completed detailed expense report. If you need help filling out your detailed expense report, please reach out to your ESG representative. If you're unsure as to who your ESG representative is, please email us at the ESG NOFA inbox. Remember, we're conducting mini monitoring for every reimbursement request. So that will include anywhere from 3 to 4 line items chosen by the HCD rep, sometimes by me. And will also include complete client files requested. if you are requesting any reimbursement from rapid rehousing and or homelessness prevention expenses. Reminder that any supporting documentation has to be redacted and it has to be submitted through the secure SharePoint site. Do not upload it into eCivis. We will have to send you an STD 209 and request you remove that information from the system. We have that secured SharePoint site set up for security reasons. And remember, we've got our HCD PII policy, which once again is on our ESG homepage under the resources tab. Next slide, please. 2022 applications award announcements are coming soon. Stay tuned. That still has not changed. I still anticipate being able to have all award announcements out by the 15th of March. So that is coming soon. Remember, for those 2022 applications, because none of the contracts have been executed, because nobody even knows who's being awarded, except for, of course, our COCs, you cannot add additional people from your organization to view the application or award. This process from last week's eCivis Small Bits with adding people, you cannot do that until you actually have a contract that's executed. Next slide, please. 2023 NOFAs are in development. They are internally routing with the anticipated release date of sometime in March. You have to use the HCD approved resolution template without any deviations. This is the same as what I have been saying, I think, the last 2 weeks now. If the template is not used and the deviations are made, you will be disqualified for not meeting threshold. This applies to all applicants across the board, meaning whether you are coming in under the COC NOFA, the non-competitive, or the competitive, doesn't matter. You have to use that template. If your board requires that you use a specialized resolution, then you can turn in that resolution, but you also have to have that template without any deviations made to it. Policies and procedures for all ESG components. So effective with the 2022 contracts, you're going to need to make sure that you start submitting your organization's policies and procedures to ESG for a review and approval, same as like those HP policies that everybody's been sending in. So it's going to be for all components. So if you want to get a jump start on that, feel free to start sending us the policies and procedures for each one of your components to the ESG NOFA inbox. Don't forget, review our policies and procedures on the ESG homepage under the resources tab. Next slide, please. Now, this is a mouthful. ESG policy documents. Once again, on the ESG webpage under the resources tab. And these are just highlighting a few of them. There are probably, I think I counted them, there were like 21, maybe 22 that are on there. So please make sure that you are reading through each one of these policies to ensure that your agency or organization is in compliance with what HCD is requiring. Next slide, please. All right, and now time for our eCivis Small Bits Corner. So this week we're going to go over submitting a basic amendment without financial changes. So what is a basic amendment? What would you submit one for? Oops, I forgot the E in the one. Sorry about that. So a basic amendment would be something to the effect of, for instance, some of our folks have CV contracts. So, and we had to add additional time onto their contracts. There were no changes necessarily to any financial things or goals, and they had to submit the amendment on their end so we could change that performance period time. That's not typical for an annual contract, but that would be for the CV contracts, as most of our COCs know. Another example of a basic amendment would be, did you want to change your goals? That would be without a financial change if you are just changing your actual goals and you're submitting that amendment in there. Doesn't necessarily mean that it has to go through the entire HCD internal routing process, but if there are specific requirements that do meet the full amendment versus a minor amendment. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by logging in to your account, and you're going to click on My Awards. Next slide, please. Click on the 3 stacked lines, also known as the pancake stack, in the Actions column, which is all the way to the right. You're going to click on Manage Award. Next slide, please. Click on the green Request Grant Amendment. And just to give you an idea of these, I think I went over these last week, but I'm just going to go over them again just so that I can kind of keep touching on this, is in that dashboard, that award detail dashboard, the 3 blue buttons that are on the left, those all have to do with just viewing information. So if you wanted to take a look at your budget, if you want to take a look at your goals, if you want to take a look at your award files, which means your standard agreement, all of the exhibits that are in there, anything that has to do with that award. That's what those 3 blue buttons mean. Then the 3 green buttons in the middle are any type of changes or financial. So the first one is that Submit Financial Report, which also is known as an RFF. In eCivis, we can't change the names of the buttons. Otherwise, it would be easier for me to just put RFF on there for you. Sorry. And then there's Submit Activity Report. And then there's Request that Grant Amendment. The yellow orange button that's right next to that Request Grant Amendment is Reward Closeout. So once you have spent everything that you either can spend or have spent your entire grant, you would click that yellow orange button and go through the entire process to close out your grant. And then last week we went over Manage Project Team, which is that blue button all the way to the right. So just to kind of throw that back out there again, you're going to click on that Request Grant Amendment button. Now, once you do that, there are 4 sections that you'll have to navigate through to complete your amendment request. The first section is the award details. Typically, there's nothing that you would need to change on here unless you are changing, for instance, if your organization is going through a name change, or if you have a new EIN number, then that's where you would change it here. Otherwise, to bypass it, if you're not changing anything, make sure to just click that blue Continue button at the bottom right where that green arrow is. Next slide, please. The second section is the financial information. And if you notice where it says Grant Amendment on this first picture, there are 4 bubbles, so you'll know where you're at for each step of the stages that you're in. So does your amendment request include any financial changes? This would include budget revisions and or adding additional funding. If the answer is yes, this amendment does include financial changes. Stop. Do not go any further with these instructions that I'm going over. And we will be going over the instructions for submitting a complex amendment with financial changes at a later date. If the answer is no, click the blue Continue button to move to the next screen. Next slide, please. The third section is Finalize Goals. So once again, does your amendment request include changes to your goals? If the answer is no, based on this target unit's first column, then you would just click the blue Continue button at the bottom right and resume to step 5. Next slide, please. If the answer is yes, Change any value in the target units column, but please do not add anything in the last 3 columns. As you can see, the very first column, target units, has the green circle oval around it with the cute little star. That is a go. The rest are a no. Next slide, please. Once the changes have been made, you're going to click that blue continue button at the bottom right. Next slide, please. And then that very 4th and final section is attach files. To upload files, you need to click that green upload file button. The one, it has a little cloud with an up arrow in it. A dialog box will open and you have 2 options to upload the documents. You can either drag and drop, which means you have to have the folder specifically open on your computer to be able to click and hold and drag it to where that box is in the middle. Or you can just click on that box in the middle that says drag files here, or click to select and upload. Next slide, please. Once you have uploaded all the files to complete your amendment request, you're going to click on the blue Done button. And I just wanted to make sure that people know that if there are specific documents that you do that say your GA has requested or your rep has requested, make sure that you are dropping those files in there so that your amendment does not get returned back to you. So once you're done, you're going to click that blue Done button, scroll towards the bottom portion of the screen to where it says Amendment Narrative. You must type a narrative, as it's a mandatory field as to what you're requesting. Please be as clear and concise as possible. This is going to tell your rep or your GA exactly what you are requesting. Next slide, please. And this is the screenshot of where that amendment narrative would be. Next slide, please. Once your narrative has been completed, click the blue Submit Amendment button at the bottom right, and then boom, you are done. It is in the hands of your rep or your GA. Next slide, please. Remember, join us at next week's eCivis Small Bits Spotlight Series. We will be going over submitting a complex budget revision, which means with financial changes. Do you and or your providers need additional help navigating eCivis? Our ESG team will set up a personal technical assistance training for you and your team. Send us an email at esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov requesting additional eCivis technical assistance. Next slide, please. And of course, our ESG team representatives, where all the magic happens. We've got Diana Prado, Giovanni Martinez, Tuesday Cool, and Anthony Zepeda. Please reach out to your ESG representative listed above, or you can contact us at the NOFA inbox if you have any questions. Otherwise, I hope that everybody had a little something that they took away from our small bits. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm going to turn it back over to Taylor.
Thank you, Sarah. I know those eCivis sessions are incredibly helpful. So thank you for that. So let's talk through some ESGCB updates. We have some reminders for our performance milestones. All program funds for projects, street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and HP must be expended by September 30th, 2023. All funds for HMIS and admin costs must be expended by October 31st, 2023. Final requests for funds must be submitted to the department by November 15th, 2023. Our HCD office hour updates, we have some upcoming sessions on March 1st regarding street outreach policy and eligibility documentation. March 8th, we're going to be talking about rapid rehousing requirements. March 15th, about homelessness prevention requirements for ESG annual. March 22nd, rapid rehousing policies. And we will have these links dropped in the chat, and you can also click them when you get the slide, or when you get the slides, you can copy and paste the links, and they'll also be dropped in the chat right now. We have some upcoming trainings for March. On March 7th, we have housing problem solving for our new and non-traditional provider series. This session will provide a fundamental understanding of what HPS is, how its core elements are implemented in relation to ESG funding, and why it is an incredibly valuable approach in homeless services. On March 16th, we have a session on shared housing as part of our community workshop series. We will discuss different types of shared housing, such as housemates, how to operationalize shared housing, landlord engagement, and potential case management items to keep in mind to increase housing stability. And you can register to join using these links. I believe they will also be dropped in our chat. For April, we have a session on evaluating client eligibility as part of our new and non-traditional provider series. This series is designed to be an introduction to client eligibility under the ESG and ESGCV program components of emergency shelter, street outreach, and rapid rehousing, as well as homelessness prevention. On April 7th, we have a community workshop series session on low barrier emergency shelter. We will discuss exactly what it means for ESG and ESGCV shelters to be low barrier. An additional session in April on hiring people on April 11th regarding hiring people with lived experiences as a part of our racial equity series. This session will review the concept of lived experience and lived expertise and share how organizations work to center and integrate PLE into decision-making, advocacy, and systems. All right, we will pause for a moment to catch up on any questions. Do we have any questions in the chat? I'm not currently able to have my chat open.
We do not, Taylor.
No question.
Okay, great. All right, you can always contact us using the ESG note by email for your annual ESG questions. And for ESGCV, please reach out to your grant administrator. All right, I'm excited to turn it over to Kristen Delkamp and Michael Thomas for our Spotlight Series presentation on emergency shelter requirements and eligibility documentation. Take it away, Kristen.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kristen Delkamp, and I am one of the ESGCV grant administrators, and I'm happy to be here with you today. Let me turn it over to my partner, Michael Thomas, who is going to introduce himself and kick off the session. Mike.
Thanks, Kristen. So I am Michael Thomas. I use he, him pronouns. I am a technical assistance provider with ICF just outside of Atlanta. And I am going to kick off our presentation today. We have a lot to cover. So I'm going to jump right in and we'll move pretty quickly through some of this. We are going to start off. So our topic today is the California HCD Emergency Shelter Policy. Next slide, please. So HCD has adopted a policy to govern emergency shelter activities delivered by agencies that receive both ESG and ESGCV funding through them. You can see what the policy looks like there on your screen. The most recent version of that policy is going to be maintained on HCD's website. You see the URL below there where you can access the portion of the website with this and many other helpful documents. And that should be a live link that you can click as well when the slides go out. Next slide, please. So why the policy? One of the guiding principles here, and probably the primary one, is that emergency shelter can serve as an essential role in providing human-centered services to engage people experiencing homelessness and connect them with appropriate resources to obtain permanent housing. You will see that we have put in bold there, human-centered services, and we've also put in bold resources to obtain permanent housing. Those are key elements of that guiding principle. The requirements in the policy are intended to ensure that subrecipients create projects that comply with all of the applicable federal laws, statutes, and regulations. that they provide assistance that's tailored to each participant's specific needs and housing barriers, and implement best practices for returning people who are experiencing sheltered homelessness to safe, stable, permanent housing, again, via those person-centered practices that are tailored to the needs of each household. Next slide, please. A really important note here. The policy does not comprehensively cover all of the federal requirements for ESG emergency shelter projects. If you receive funding for emergency shelter through ESG or ESG-CV from California HCD, it is your responsibility to read and understand all of the federal requirements, and that includes primarily the ESG program interim rule, uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements. If it's ESG-CV, it includes all the applicable notices from HUD and any other guidance that HUD may issue from time to time. So again, it is your responsibility to know all of those federal requirements. This policy does not comprehensively cover every one of them in detail. Next slide, please. So the first requirement we're going to talk about from the policy is written policies and procedures. All emergency shelter projects must develop and implement written policies and procedures that fully detail their operations. So if you're delivering direct services, if you're providing shelter, you have to have project level policies and procedures to cover how you deliver those services and run your shelter. The policies and procedures must, at a minimum, include the items that we are going to cover on the following slides. Next slide, please. So the first requirement is that your project level policies and procedures must be consistent with the ESG written standards implemented by HCD, by its subrecipients, and or the local continuum of care. So the most common scenario here, there are some variations. The most common scenario is HCD provides the ESG funding to the local administrative entity. That entity then subgrants the funding to service providers. If you are that service provider, then the administrative entity should have ESG written standards. Your policies and procedures must be consistent with those local written standards. Again, that's just the most common scenario. I know there are variations out there. ESG emergency shelter projects must comply with the written standards, both via their written policies and procedures and how they actually implement services. So, it's one thing to put it in writing, it's another thing to actually do it. If there is a conflict between the ESG and COC written standards, then you should contact HCD for guidance on how to resolve that conflict. The policies and procedures must detail how the project will participate in the local coordinated entry system to ensure that participants are connected quickly to the resources available through that system, including ESG funded permanent housing projects. So you have to detail how you're going to work with the local coordinated entry system. The policies and procedures must detail how the project establishes and documents participant eligibility. We are going to provide more details on that later in this presentation. And then the suite of services. The policies and procedures must define the full suite of ESG eligible services provided by the project and the process for assessing household needs and barriers to develop an individualized case plan for access to the needed services. What we're kind of getting at here is it's not uncommon to see project level policies and procedures that just include a list of every eligible service under the ESG program when the project doesn't actually have funding or staff to deliver all of those services. So your policies and procedures should reflect your actual service offering. Next slide, please. The policies and procedures must also detail your staffing pattern. That includes estimated caseloads for case managers, estimated commitment for other staff. So that means if you have a budget for security, for maintenance staff, food service workers, whatever that might be for your shelter, what the estimated time commitment would be for those staff, and a process to enter data into HMIS or a comparable database if you're a victim service provider in a way that's accurate and timely. So the policies and procedures must indicate that there is a dedicated staff member or process for some staff member to do that. Housing problem solving. The policies and procedures must detail how the project will provide housing problem solving approaches. projects are required to provide diversion and rapid exit. I'm going to repeat that. Emergency shelter projects, according to the policy, are required to provide diversion and rapid exit approaches. For more information on that, you can see the California HCD Housing Problem Solving Policy. It has a full overview of what this requirement means. Other requirements, policies and procedures must meet any other requirements for the project based on federal, state, local, or other mandates. So it's often impossible to know what all of the local mandates might be for an emergency shelter. If there are others, you have to comply with those too, of course. And then finally, general operations. Your project level policies and procedures must provide sufficient information about the operations of your project so that a person not familiar with the project could reasonably reconstruct it using your policies and procedures as a guide. Next slide, please. And this one is over to you, Kristen.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, let's talk about policy and procedure approval. All ESG emergency shelter policies and procedures must be approved by California HCD. PNPs must be submitted to California HCD for approval, and California HCD may choose not to issue reimbursements prior to PNP approval. California HCD is the sole arbiter of whether PNPs meet its requirements. PNPs are approved upon written, signed confirmation from California HCD. And please note that California HCD reserves the right to withdraw its approval at any time. Next slide, please. Projects are required to participate to the maximum extent possible in the coordinated entry process for the local COC or COCs. Coordinated entry provides a critical path from homelessness to housing. Projects are strongly encouraged to consult with their local COC or COCs early in the project design process to maximize coordinated entry integration. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about termination and appeals policy. A termination and appeals policy is required by HUD and California HCD for all projects. It must comply with all requirements of 24 CFR 576.402, terminating assistance. It must contain a provision that assistance will only be terminated in the most severe cases, and it must comply with any other mandates which may be found in the California HCD contract documents, ESG written standards, or COC written standards. Finally, the policy must detail steps the project will take to ensure that any participant who is terminated from the project does not return to an unsheltered location as a result of the termination. Next slide, please. California HCD intends to prohibit ESG emergency shelter projects from specifying either a minimum or maximum length of stay for participants. California HCD intends to implement this requirement in the following phases. For fiscal year 2022, California HCD provided training and technical assistance to equip existing projects to transition between models. For fiscal year 2023, California HCD will continue to provide training and technical assistance. California HCD will also incorporate this requirement into its monitoring process, issuing concerns to projects that are still incorporating minimum or maximum lengths of stay. And for fiscal year 2024, California HCD will continue to provide training and technical assistance and will continue to incorporate this requirement into its monitoring process, but it will be issuing findings rather than concerns. And beginning with the fiscal year 2024 NOFO, California HCD will discontinue funding to projects with minimum or maximum lengths of stay. Next slide, please. On the screen, you can see that this is a very broad overview of emergency shelter activities. And because we've done several trainings on these activities and time is limited today, we will not cover these in depth. However, please note that eligible activity categories include essential services, renovation, shelter operations, assistance required under URA, additional eligible activities for ESG CV identified in notices CPD 21-05, CPD 21-08, and CPD 22-06. Next slide, please, and back over to Mike.
All right, Thank you very much. So we're going to spend a little more time on these upcoming slides. We want to talk about participant eligibility and documentation. So let's jump right in on eligibility. Eligible participants for shelter projects are, we're going to start with categories 1 and 4 of the homeless definition. Category 1 is literally homeless. So that's an individual or family that lacks a fixed, regular nighttime residence. And that means that their primary nighttime residence is a public or private place not meant for human habitation. So we're thinking parks, cars, things like that. They may be living in a publicly or privately operated shelter designed to provide temporary living arrangements. That includes congregate shelters, transitional housing, and hotels and motels if they are paid for by a charitable organization or government program. So someone is literally homeless if they are in an emergency shelter or other emergency housing situation. They may also be exiting an institution where they resided for 90 days or less and reside in an emergency shelter or a place not meant for human habitation immediately before they entered that institution. And then moving on to category 4, that is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. And that includes any individual or family who is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. They have no other residence and they lack the support networks to obtain other permanent housing. Fleeing DV is also understood to include survivors of human trafficking, which is currently being codified at various different levels of the federal government. Many of you may have seen the pending language with VAWA that would implement a new definition here. So there are some moving parts, but this is where category 4 stands right now. Next slide, please. So we also want to talk briefly about the other 2 categories. So shelter also includes at the federal level, people at imminent risk of homelessness. That's those who would be losing their housing within 14 days, have no subsequent residence, and lack the support networks to remain housed. And people who meet HUD's category 3 definition. So that's broadly speaking, people who might qualify as homeless under other federal definitions besides this one from HUD and have other risk factors. However, no projects in California with these funding sources have been approved to serve that definition. So we're not going to address it further here. And also note that these additional categories, so this is category 2 and 3, are excluded from the California HCD emergency shelter policy. So they're not included there. Next slide, please. An important note for ESG-CV. For ESG-CV, category 1 is expanded, and it is expanded to say that someone who is residing in an institution may have been there for 120 days or less instead of the usual 90 days or less. But all other qualifying factors remain the same. So it's just an increased length of stay in the institution that's eligible. The person or household still had to be in a literal homeless situation before they entered that institution. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about documenting participant eligibility. Next slide, please. So when you read the ESG program interim rule, the specified order of priority for documentation is what you see on the left there. Third-party documentation is considered the gold standard. The next level would be intake worker observations of the living situation. And then the final lower tier would be certification from the person seeking assistance, also known as a self-certification of homelessness. It is really important to point out here that there are some critical exceptions to the order of priority for emergency shelter projects specifically. And these are spelled out there. Sorry, I see a typo in shelters. That should say shelters. The exceptions are: lack of third-party documentation must never prevent someone from being immediately admitted to shelter. So in other words, you cannot require third-party documentation for someone to enter the shelter. That cannot be a barrier. If someone is experiencing literal homelessness and they need shelter, they must be admitted without requirement for third-party documentation. In fact, HUD recognizes that third-party documentation is not feasible for emergency shelter in most cases. Self-certification, such as a sign-in sheet, is acceptable and it is low barrier. And in higher volume shelters is often the most feasible way to do it. Do note that if you use a sign-in sheet, it must have a self-certification statement on it. So the person must be certifying that they are literally homeless at the time of shelter entry. But as long as you have that self-certification statement, it is a perfectly acceptable method of documentation. Also important here, if someone is actively fleeing domestic violence, agencies should never seek higher levels of documentation beyond self-certification unless doing so will not further endanger the participant. The way that this works for a victim service provider versus a non-victim service provider is slightly different. We're going to talk about that in coming slides, but I just want to point out safety is paramount with people fleeing DV. An agency should never seek anything beyond self-certification unless there is a compelling reason and it does not endanger the participant. So safety is paramount. Next slide, please. Notes here on entry exit versus night by night shelters. So an entry exit shelter, and this is it's a method of operation and it is a way that your shelter would be set up in HMIS. Entry exit is a shelter where participants may stay more than one night and they may remain enrolled regardless of whether they leave during the day. When that is how your shelter operates, then documentation must be obtained on the first night that the household stays in the shelter, and that documentation justifies their shelter stay, whatever that length is. Night by night is when participants may only stay one night in the shelter and they are required to leave in the morning, and then they may show up and may get a bed the next night, but it's not guaranteed. So it is exactly what it says. It is a night by night shelter. They can only stay for one night. If that's how your shelter operates, documentation must be obtained each night when the household enters the shelter. So every time a household enters, you have to document their literal homeless status. Next slide, please. So for documenting category 1, this is the wording straight from HUD. So if the person, oh wait, I'm sorry, this is you, Kristen. I apologize, I stepped on your slide.
That's okay. You were doing great. The first definition is living in a place not meant for human habitation or another shelter. The following make up the options for documentation for this section of category 1. Written observation by an outreach worker of the conditions where the individual or family was living, or written referral by another housing or service provider, or certification by the individual or head of household that they are living on the streets or in another shelter. The second definition, which Mike mentioned earlier, is exiting an institution and had previously lived in a place not meant for human habitation or an emergency shelter before entering the institution. In this case, we need one of the forms of evidence above and either discharge paperwork or a written or oral referral from a social worker, case manager, or other appropriate official of the institution, excuse me, stating the beginning and end dates of the time residing in the institution. Oral statements, by the way, must be recorded by the intake worker. Or a written record of the intake worker's due diligence in attempting to obtain the evidence described above, and certification by the individual seeking assistance that states they are exiting or just exited an institution where they resided for 90 days or less, or 120 days for ESG-CV. Next slide, please. And now we're going to give a couple of examples of documentation. So in the example of a household that is brought to a shelter by an outreach worker, ideally the outreach worker provides a detailed, signed, written statement of where the household was living prior to arriving at the shelter. In the example of a household previously stayed in a hotel via a voucher from an agency, from another agency, you'd be looking for a written statement from the previous shelter provider or HMIS records showing enrollment with the previous shelter provider, or signed certification from the head of household that includes a statement regarding receipt of the previous hotel or motel voucher. Next slide, please. In the event that a household presents at a shelter with no connection to services, you would be seeking signed certification from the head of household with the details of the living situation, or an HMIS record showing recent engagement with street outreach, emergency shelter, or other services for those experiencing literal homelessness. And in the event that a household presents at the shelter immediately after exiting jail, detox, or another institution, you'd be seeking certification from the head of household of literal homelessness immediately before entering the institution, or an HMIS record showing homelessness immediately before entering the institution, or written documentation from the service providers showing literal homelessness immediately before entering the institution, and discharge paperwork including dates of institutional entry and exit, or an oral statement from an institutional official stating dates of entry and exit recorded by an intake worker, or signed certification from the head of household, including a length of institutional stay and also including a written record of the intake worker's due diligence to obtain higher level documentation. Next slide, please, and back over to Mike.
Thank you, Kristen. So let's talk about category 4, fleeing DV. And this is where we're going to cover what I mentioned earlier, that it's a little different for victim service providers versus non-victim service providers based on the ESG program interim rule. So this is what HUD says in that rule about documentation if you are a victim service provider. If you're a victim service provider, then an oral statement by the individual or head of household recorded by the intake worker that the household is fleeing, has no subsequent residence that has been identified, and that they lack resources and support networks to obtain other housing. So you're really just, it's an oral statement, it's recorded by the intake worker, and it shows that all of these requirements are met. That oral statement must include a certification by the individual or head of household or intake worker that the household has not identified housing and lacks support networks. So in other words, either the person presenting, the head of the household presenting, or the intake worker is signing and certifying that the household has not identified housing and doesn't have support networks. When an agency is not a victim service provider and someone presents and is qualifying under category 4, then you're looking for an oral statement recorded by the intake worker and including a certification by the individual or the head of household that the oral statement is true and complete. So that's an additional thing there. There just has to be something on that documentation where they are signing off that the oral statement is true and complete. Where the safety of the individual or family would not be jeopardized, then the domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or other life-threatening condition must be verified by a written observation by the intake worker or a written referral by a housing service provider, social worker, legal assistance provider, healthcare provider, law enforcement agency, pastoral counselor, or any organization from whom the household has sought assistance. So that's a really long way of saying that if you're not a victim service provider, and this is the most important part, if it doesn't jeopardize the safety of the household, then the intake worker must try to get some higher level of documentation. So that's their own observation potentially, or a written referral. But I really want to circle back to if it doesn't jeopardize safety. If it's going to cause the person to be less safe by pursuing this, then you don't pursue it. The written referral or observation needs only include the minimum amount of information necessary to document the condition. So if you decide it does not jeopardize safety and you're pursuing the written referral or the observation to meet this requirement, it only needs the minimum amount of information necessary to document the condition of their fleeing. Next slide, please. So here are some examples. If a household, and this, I use this example because it's one we saw in the community I used to work in quite a bit. If a household is brought to a victim service provider shelter by a law enforcement officer, then documentation you'd be looking for there would be an oral statement recorded and certified by the intake worker stating that the household is fleeing, has not identified housing, and lacks support networks. So right when I say that, I'm saying an oral statement from the person who is presenting, so the individual or head of household. Or the documentation in that situation might also be a signed certification from the law enforcement officer who's bringing them to the shelter that states that the person is fleeing, lacks housing and support networks. Either of those is perfectly acceptable. What we used to see in the community I worked with was that sometimes the person actively fleeing, when they were brought by a law enforcement officer, they're currently undergoing extreme trauma. And so they didn't in many cases have the capacity necessarily to go through the process of intake. And so it was perfectly acceptable to have the law enforcement officer sign what was usually a pre-made form by the agency that meets the requirements for documentation. So either of those is acceptable there. If a household presents at a victim service provider, and has no connection to services that can be demonstrated, then all you're really looking for there is an oral statement by the person or head of household presenting. It's recorded by the intake worker. It states that they are fleeing, they lack support networks, and then it is certified, or in other words, signed off on by the individual head of household, or potentially even the intake worker. So the intake worker can really handle that whole process. Next slide, please. Some more examples, and this is for non-victim service providers. So if a household is brought to a non-victim service provider shelter by law enforcement, then a written referral signed by the law enforcement officer stating that the household is fleeing, lacks housing and support networks is going to be your ideal standard there. If that's not possible, then you can get the oral statement recorded by an intake worker, or including signed certification that the statement is true and complete. And remember, if you're not a victim service provider, you have to remember that it must certify that it's true and complete on that statement. If a household presents at a non-victim service provider shelter and has no other connection to services, then an oral statement recorded by the intake worker stating that they are fleeing, lack support networks and housing, and it has that signed certification that it's true and complete. So again, that's really what you're looking for there. Only if it doesn't jeopardize safety, then the intake worker would perform due diligence to try and obtain either observational verification or a written referral. But again, only if it doesn't jeopardize safety. Next slide, please. And back to you, Kristen.
Okay, coming down the home stretch here, a couple of important notes that we want to mention about documentation. First, for items that require certification, for example, oral third-party statements or self-certification, it may be beneficial to develop standardized forms to ensure compliance. Then you can have those available in the moment when you need them. Next slide, please. Eligibility is generally based on where an individual or household stayed immediately prior to intake and enrollment. HUD would generally consider it reasonable to establish a policy that considers where the individual or family had been residing for up to a week prior to intake and enrollment. Any such policy at the service provider level must comply with local ESG written standards or other applicable mandates. And the 7-day time frame is based on the most recently available HUD guidance. It's not a regulation and thus is subject to change. Next slide, please.
Do you mind if I add one detail on that last slide?
Not at
Kristen?
all.
I want to note that we specifically put that in because there was previous guidance from HUD saying that that time period was 14 days, but that has been changed. So if anyone is operating under that previous guidance that HUD would consider where someone was 14 days before presenting, that is no longer the current guidance. So that's also a good example of HUD changed the guidance.
There is a question that came up in the chat. I'll toss this one to you, Mike, from Kat Richter. Kat wants to know, where could we get more information about the efforts on expanding the definition of Category 4, including human trafficking?
I'm going to ask if anyone on our team happens to have the link, because we did a presentation recently on VAWA, which I believe included a lot of information on that. If not, I can try to track it down.
I have the link, and Kat, I can send that to you after the presentation. If you want to go ahead and just private message me your email, I'll get that out to you. other questions that
Kristen,
people
it
might
might
have?
be good when we do our follow-up email to include it with the slides also, so that then other people could review it and comment on it.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's a great idea. Feel free to come off of mute too if you have a question that you're wanting to ask.
We do have another question in the chat, Kristen. If category 3 is no longer 14 days, then what is it?
So I can take that one. I think we're talking about two separate things. So category 3 is a specific category within the homelessness definition that, as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is not included because no agencies in California with these funding streams have been approved by HCD to serve category 3. So we didn't really address category 3 in this presentation. The 7-day time frame we were talking about is from something that's come up in the field before, where agencies were looking not only at where a person slept last night, but they were looking back for a couple of weeks. Like, have they been sleeping on the street for a couple of weeks? Did they sleep on the street for, 13 days, and maybe they were in a house for one of those days, like that kind of thing? And the previous guidance was that if it was based on written policy, so again, it had to be a policy of how you run your project, that you were looking back at a time period. The previous guidance was that that time period would be considered reasonable if it were up to 14 days. What changed was something that was never a regulation. It was just HUD guidance that had been put out by HUD, but they are now saying that 14 days is not reasonable, but looking back for up to 7 days would be considered reasonable if it's a written policy.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
All right, another one. What if a service provider provides nightly motel stays for persons who are not fit for congregate shelter? Would they still need to provide an ESPNP manual?
I'm going to defer to HCD if I am incorrect, but I believe the answer is yes. If you're providing emergency shelter services, you need a policy and procedure manual.
And the HCD team has said correct in their messaging. Anyone else have any questions that they want to answer or that they want to have answered? Okay, well then, Mike, I think that we've wrapped up all the Q&As. Oh, nope, we didn't. We got another one. Describe an example of coordinated entry integration of ES.
I will give one example. There are a number of ways that this can look. One example could be if you have a physical emergency shelter, then it might be that coordinated entry assessments are being performed at that shelter for people who are residing there so that they can then be pulled into the coordinated entry system and prioritized for permanent housing projects. So again, that's just one example. It can look a lot of different ways. That's one that I have seen in communities before. And certainly if anyone else has an example from the team, feel free to throw it out there.
Okay, well, we have reached the top of the hour, so I'll go ahead and throw it back to LaQuantia to close us out.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Mike, and thank you everyone for your questions, which means that you are engaging and had some questions and didn't quite understand. So we thank you for not being too shy to ask those questions. Again, once we exit this session, a question will pop up, survey question will pop up. Please answer that question for us to help us better assist you all with the needs that you have to better serve your communities. And as Kristen and Aaron both stated earlier, slides will come out to you, and we'll make sure that the follow-up question that needed a link be added to that email. And we look forward to seeing you guys next week. Have a good rest of your week.